What happens when a Hollywood star known for staying composed suddenly refuses to stay quiet on live television? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The cameras are already rolling, the audience is clapping, and the energy in the studio feels upbeat, at least at first. Keira Knightley is sitting comfortably on the panel, smiling politely as the applause fades. Alyssa Farah Griffin leans forward slightly, notes in hand, ready to guide the conversation into something more serious. The rest of the hosts exchange quick glances, sensing where things might go. Alyssa starts with a friendly tone. Keira, it's so great to have you here. You've had such an incredible career, and you've been very outspoken lately about industry standards and expectations, especially when it comes to women. Keira nods, still relaxed. Yes, it's something I've experienced for years, really. It's not new, but I think people are finally talking about it more openly now. The audience murmurs in agreement. A few claps ripple through the room. Alyssa continues, but her tone shifts just slightly. Right, and I think a lot of people respect that. But some critics say that celebrities speaking on these issues can come off as disconnected from everyday struggles. How do you respond to that? There's a subtle shift in the room. One of the co-hosts raises her eyebrows slightly. Keira pauses for a moment, not uncomfortable, but clearly choosing her words carefully. Well, she says, her voice calm but firmer now, I think that's a very easy way to dismiss what someone is saying without actually engaging with it. A few audience members clap again, louder this time. Alyssa gives a small smile, but doesn't back off. I don't think it's about dismissing, though. I think it's about perspective. A lot of people watching at home might feel like, you're in Hollywood, you have privilege. How can you really understand what I'm going through? Keira tilts her head slightly. But that assumes that because someone has success in one area, they don't experience challenges in others. That's not how life works. There's a brief pause. The tension isn't explosive yet, but it's noticeable. Another host tries to soften the moment. I think what Alyssa's getting at is relatability. But Keira gently interrupts, still polite but more direct now. No, I understand what she's getting at. I just don't agree with the framing. The audience reacts with a mix of oohs and light applause. Alyssa leans back slightly, then forward again, clearly not backing down. Okay, so let's talk about that framing. Because when you speak about industry pressure, for example, there are people working two jobs who might feel like, that's not the same level of pressure. Keira smiles, but it's tighter now. Of course it's not the same. I've never said it was. But pressure isn't a competition. It's not about who has it worse. The room grows quieter. One of the co-hosts nods. That's actually a really important point. But Alyssa jumps back in. But don't you think sometimes the messaging can come across that way? That it feels like. Keira raises her hand slightly, not aggressively, but enough to pause her. No, I think sometimes the messaging gets interpreted that way because it's more convenient to do that than to actually listen. That lands. You can feel it. The audience reacts again, this time louder. Some clapping, some murmurs, a few surprised laughs. Alyssa's expression changes, still composed, but now more serious. So you're saying people are choosing not to listen? I'm saying, Keira replies, her voice steady, that when women speak about their experiences, especially in industries like mine, there's often an immediate push to minimize it. A co-host nods slowly. That's true in a lot of spaces. Alyssa shakes her head slightly. I don't think it's about minimizing. I think it's about context. Keira leans forward just a bit. But context shouldn't erase the conversation. There's a beat. The audience is fully engaged now. One of the other hosts tries to jump in again, smiling nervously. Okay, this is getting interesting. The audience laughs, breaking the tension for a second. But Alyssa keeps going. I just think there's a responsibility when you have a platform that big to be aware of how your words land. Keira nods immediately. I agree with that. Completely. But that responsibility goes both ways. There's also a responsibility to not twist what's being said into something it isn't. That gets a strong reaction, applause louder this time. Alyssa exhales slightly, then smiles, but it's a controlled smile. No one's twisting anything. We're just asking questions. And I'm answering them, Keira responds, just as quickly. The timing creates a small ripple of laughter from the audience. Another host leans in, trying to balance things. I think what's happening here is actually a really good conversation, because both of you are talking about perception versus intention. Keira nods. Exactly. Alyssa adds, an impact. Keira looks at her. Yes, impact. But impact can be influenced by how something is framed by others, not just what's originally said. Now the tension is fully visible. No one's yelling, but the energy has shifted completely from the light, promotional interview it started as. The audience is quiet, hanging on every word. One of the co-hosts glances toward the producers off camera, then back to the table. We didn't expect to go this deep this early, but I'm glad we did. Alyssa gives a small laugh. Well, that's what live TV is for, right? Keira smiles again, but there's still an edge there. Exactly. There's a brief pause, the kind that only happens when everyone knows something just shifted. And then Alyssa leans in one more time, her tone sharper now. But let me ask you this directly. Do you think Hollywood voices sometimes overshadow the voices that actually need to be heard more? The audience reacts instantly, a mix of gasps and murmurs. Keira doesn't answer right away. She looks at Alyssa, then at the rest of the panel, then briefly out toward the audience. And when she finally speaks, her tone is no longer just calm. It's firm, deliberate, and unmistakably serious. That depends, she says slowly, on who you think needs to be heard. The room goes completely still. And just like that, what started as a routine interview has turned into something much bigger. Something no one in that studio is going to forget. The silence lingers for just a second longer than usual. The kind that makes everyone aware this isn't a typical segment anymore. Alyssa Farah Griffin doesn't look away. She holds Keira Knightley's gaze, nodding slightly as if acknowledging the weight of that response. Well, Alyssa says, her voice measured but firmer now. I think a lot of people would say voices outside of elite spaces, people who don't have access, who aren't constantly given platforms. Those are the voices that need amplification the most. A few audience members clap in agreement. It's not overwhelming, but it's enough to signal where part of the room stands. Keira nods slowly, taking that in. And I don't disagree with that, she replies. But I think the idea that someone like me speaking automatically takes space away from someone else, that's where I struggle. A co-host leans in, curious. So you don't see it as a zero-sum situation? No, Keira answers immediately. Because if we start deciding who is allowed to speak based on their circumstances, that becomes a very slippery slope. Alyssa tilts her head. But isn't that already happening in a different way? I mean, certain voices are prioritized because of fame, because of visibility, because of influence. Keira doesn't hesitate. That's not the fault of the person speaking. That's the structure of the system we're all operating in. There's a noticeable reaction from the audience, a mix of applause and thoughtful murmurs. One of the other hosts interjects, trying to keep things balanced. But Keira, some would argue that once you're aware of that system, there's a responsibility to step back at times. Keira turns to her, still composed. And I think that's a fair conversation to have. But stepping back shouldn't mean staying silent altogether. Alyssa jumps in quickly. No one's saying stay silent. But maybe it's about how much space you take up when you do speak. That line lands hard. The audience lets out a collective, ooh, and a few people clap again. Keira exhales softly, not frustrated, but clearly engaged now at a deeper level. But how do you measure that? She asks. Who decides what's too much? Alyssa responds without missing a beat. I think the public does. The audience does. Keira gives a small, almost incredulous smile. But the public isn't a single voice. It's millions of different perspectives. Another co-host nods. That's true. There's no one standard. Alyssa leans forward again, her tone sharpening just slightly. But there is a general sentiment sometimes. And we've seen backlash before when celebrities speak on issues and people feel it's out of touch. Keira's expression shifts, not defensive, but more pointed. Backlash doesn't always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it just means something is uncomfortable. The audience reacts instantly, louder applause this time, mixed with a few audible yes. Alyssa presses her lips together briefly, then nods. That's fair. But discomfort doesn't automatically equal truth either. Keira nods right back. Agreed. There's a brief pause, but it's not awkward, it's charged. One of the hosts laughs lightly, trying to ease the intensity. Okay, I feel like we're in a debate class right now. The audience laughs along, grateful for the moment of release. But Alyssa isn't done. Let me bring it back to something specific, she says, turning slightly toward Keira. You've spoken about the pressures women face in Hollywood, body image, expectations, all of that. And again, valid. But when someone working a minimum wage job hears that, they might think, I don't have the luxury to even think about those things. Do you understand why that disconnect happens? Keira listens carefully this time, not interrupting. She nods slowly before responding. I do understand why it might feel that way, she says. But I think it's based on an assumption that those issues only exist in certain spaces. Body image, for example, isn't exclusive to Hollywood. It affects people everywhere. A co-host jumps in. That's absolutely true. Keira continues, her voice steady. The difference is visibility. In my industry, it's magnified. It's constant. But that doesn't mean it's more important than anyone else's experience. Alyssa raises a hand slightly, as if to clarify. But when you talk about it publicly, it becomes amplified in a different way. Yes, Keira agrees. And that amplification can help bring attention to something that already exists beyond my world. The audience claps again, this time more evenly split, some clearly siding with Keira, others still reserved. Alyssa leans back for a moment, then forward again, choosing her next words carefully. I think where people struggle is feeling like those conversations sometimes center voices that are already heard the most. Keira nods, but her response comes quickly. But if those voices are used to highlight broader issues, isn't that part of the solution? There's a pause. A co-host looks between them. That's actually a really interesting point, using visibility as a tool rather than seeing it as a problem. Alyssa shakes her head slightly. It can be both, though. That's the nuance here. Keira smiles faintly. I agree. It is nuanced. But nuance often gets lost when the conversation turns into you shouldn't speak because of who you are. That line hits again. The audience reacts with another wave of applause. Alyssa's expression tightens just a bit. I don't think anyone said you shouldn't speak. Keira responds immediately. No, but that's often the implication in these conversations. A co-host quickly steps in, sensing the tension rising again. Okay, I think what we're seeing here is two perspectives that are actually closer than they sound, but the wording is what's creating the friction. The audience murmurs in agreement. Alyssa nods, but doesn't fully concede. Maybe, but wording matters. Keira leans slightly forward again. Exactly. And that's why I'm being very careful with mine. That draws a small but noticeable reaction, a mix of laughter and ooze from the audience. Alyssa smiles, but there's a competitive edge to it now. As am I. Another host claps her hands lightly, trying to shift the tone. Okay, this is definitely one of the most honest conversations we've had in a while. The audience applauds. But just as it seems like things might ease up, Alyssa turns slightly, her voice calm but pointed again. Can I ask you something a little more direct? Keira doesn't hesitate. Of course. Alyssa holds her gaze. Do you think sometimes celebrities underestimate how their words can come across as dismissive? Even when that's not the intention? The audience goes quiet again. Keira takes a breath, her expression thoughtful, but there's a clear firmness behind it now. I think, she begins slowly, that sometimes people project dismissal onto statements that are simply different from their own experience. A few audience members react immediately, some clapping, others murmuring. Alyssa raises her eyebrows slightly. So it's projection? Keira shakes her head gently. Not always, but sometimes yes. The tension is back, stronger than before. One of the co-hosts looks toward the camera briefly, then back at the table. This is one of those conversations where everyone at home is probably talking back to their TV right now. The audience laughs, but it's a knowing laugh. They're fully invested. Alyssa leans in again, clearly not ready to let it go. But don't you think, she says, her tone more intense now, that it's worth examining why that projection happens in the first place? Keira meets her gaze without hesitation. And don't you think, she replies, her voice just as steady, it's worth examining why certain voices are so quickly challenged the moment they speak. The audience erupts, louder than before, a mix of applause, gasps, and surprised reactions. The energy at the table shifts again, sharper, more charged than at any point so far. And now it's clear to everyone watching. This isn't just a discussion anymore. It's a real clash unfolding live, with neither side willing to step back. The reaction from the audience doesn't die down immediately this time. It lingers, applause mixed with murmurs, a few people leaning forward in their seats, others exchanging looks like they just witnessed something shift into a different gear entirely. One of the co-hosts exhales and laughs softly, almost in disbelief. Okay, wow. This is where live TV gets very real. Alyssa Farah Griffin gives a small nod, but her eyes stay locked on Keira Knightley. She's not smiling now, not unfriendly, but fully serious. I don't think anyone here is trying to silence you. she says, her tone controlled but more pointed than before. But questioning influence isn't the same as shutting someone down. Keira responds immediately, her voice calm but firmer than at any point earlier. And speaking honestly about lived experience isn't the same as dominating a conversation. A few people in the audience clap quickly, short, sharp bursts of agreement. Alyssa leans back slightly, then folds her hands together on the table. But influence comes with weight. And when you speak, people listen, sometimes more than they listen to others who might be closer to the issue. Keira nods once. That may be true, but I can't control who listens more. What I can control is whether I use that attention responsibly. A co-host jumps in, sensing the intensity but also the importance of the moment. And that's really what this comes down to, responsibility, right? Because both of you are actually talking about responsibility, just from different angles. Alyssa gestures lightly with her hand. Exactly. And I think part of that responsibility is recognizing when your platform might overshadow someone else's voice, even unintentionally. Keira turns slightly toward her, her expression steady, but there's a noticeable edge now. But again, that assumes that me speaking is the reason someone else isn't being heard. The audience reacts, a mix of sounds and a few claps. Alyssa doesn't hesitate. It can be part of the reason. Not the only reason, but part of it. Keira's eyebrows lift slightly. But then where does that logic stop? Do we start ranking voices? Deciding who gets to speak based on some kind of hierarchy? Another co-host raises her hand slightly, trying to mediate. Okay, let's not turn this into an either-or, because I think there's a middle ground here. But Alyssa speaks over gently, not aggressively, just eager to clarify. No one's talking about a hierarchy. It's about awareness. Keira responds just as quickly. And I am aware. That overlap creates a small ripple of tension. The kind where both speakers are clearly engaged and not waiting for the other to finish anymore. The audience reacts with a soft, ooh. Alyssa nods, but her tone sharpens slightly. Then with that awareness, do you ever choose not to speak on certain issues? There's a brief pause. Keira doesn't look away. Yes, she says simply. The answer is direct, but it doesn't diffuse anything. Alyssa follows up immediately. And how do you decide which ones? Keira takes a breath, then answers carefully. I decide based on whether I have something meaningful to add, not based on whether someone thinks I should stay quiet because of my position. The audience claps again, louder this time. A co-host nods. That's a fair standard. But Alyssa tilts her head slightly. But who defines meaningful in that context? Keira gives a small, almost incredulous smile again. The kind that's not dismissive, but definitely questioning. The person speaking. Alyssa shakes her head. But that's subjective. So is the criticism, Keira replies immediately. That lands hard. The audience reacts again, louder applause, a few scattered cheers. One of the co-hosts leans back, fanning herself lightly with a cue card. Okay, this is intense. The audience laughs, but the tension doesn't really break this time. Alyssa exhales through her nose, then leans forward again, clearly determined to push this to a clearer point. Let me ask you this in a different way, she says. Do you think there are times when celebrities, not just you, but celebrities in general, insert themselves into conversations in ways that can feel performative? There's a noticeable shift again. The word performative hangs in the air. A few audience members murmur, some nodding, others clearly reacting to the phrasing. Keira doesn't respond immediately this time. She pauses, thinking, then speaks slowly. I think, she says, that there are people in every space who can come across that way. Not just celebrities. Alyssa nods. Of course. But labeling it that way, Keira continues, can also be a way to dismiss genuine engagement. A co-host interjects, trying to balance. That's true. Intent is hard to measure from the outside. Alyssa agrees with a quick nod. Intent is hard to measure, but impact isn't. Keira looks at her directly. Impact is interpreted. Alyssa responds instantly. But interpretation comes from real reactions. Keira doesn't back down. Yes, but reactions can be influenced by narratives that are built around what's being said. The audience is fully locked in now, quiet, attentive, hanging on every exchange. One of the co-hosts glances toward the producers again, then back. I have to say, this is one of the most layered conversations we've had here in a long time. Another host nods. And it's important because people at home are dealing with these exact questions, just in different contexts. Alyssa turns slightly toward the rest of the panel, then back to Keira. And that's exactly why it matters how these conversations happen. Because when someone with your level of influence speaks, it shapes how others talk about these issues too. Keira's voice softens slightly, but the firmness is still there. And that's why I take it seriously. But taking it seriously doesn't mean stepping aside entirely. Alyssa counters, no, but it might mean making more space intentionally. Keira nods. And I do that. Alyssa raises her eyebrows slightly. But do you think it's enough? There's a small but noticeable reaction from the audience, a mix of curiosity and tension. Keira leans forward just a bit more than before, her posture more engaged now. I think, she says slowly, that the expectation for it to ever be enough can become a way to constantly move the goalpost. That line hits. The audience reacts strongly, applause, a few surprised laughs, even someone saying, "That's true," loud enough to be heard. Alyssa presses her lips together, then nods once. Or it can be a way to push for more accountability. Keira doesn't hesitate. Accountability is important, but it has to be applied fairly. Alyssa responds quickly. And you don't think it is? Keira meets her gaze. Not always. There's a pause. A co-host leans in, sensing just how far this has escalated. Okay, I think we're touching on something bigger here, not just about celebrities, but about who gets questioned and how. The audience murmurs in agreement. Alyssa nods, but she's still focused. Exactly. And I think people are asking more questions now, across the board. Keira replies calmly. And that's a good thing. Alyssa adds, but those questions should be answered. Keira's response is immediate. And I am answering them. The timing again creates that sharp overlap, the kind that makes the audience react with another wave of oohs. One of the hosts laughs nervously. Okay, we are definitely not holding back today. The audience laughs too, but there's still that charged undercurrent. Alyssa leans back for a moment, then forward again, her tone slightly more direct than before. I just want to be clear, this isn't personal. It's about a broader conversation. Keira nods, but her response carries weight. I understand that. But these conversations are always personal for someone. That line shifts the tone again, quieter, heavier. The audience doesn't clap immediately this time. There's a pause, then softer applause follows. Alyssa looks at her for a second longer, then nods slowly. That's fair. For a brief moment, it feels like things might settle. But then one of the co-hosts, trying to bring in another angle, asks, do you think this conversation would even be happening the same way if the roles were reversed? That question lands differently. Alyssa turns her head slightly. What do you mean? The host continues. I mean, if someone from a different background, a different industry, was sitting here saying the same things, would we be pushing them the same way? The audience murmurs again, intrigued. Alyssa considers it, then responds carefully. I think tough questions are fair, no matter who you are. Keira looks at her, then says quietly but clearly, I agree. But I also think those questions aren't always asked equally. And just like that, the tension rises again, not louder but deeper. The conversation has moved beyond just disagreement now. It's become something more layered, more personal, and far more difficult to resolve in a single segment. There's a noticeable shift in the room after that last exchange. It's not explosive. No one is raising their voice, but the weight of the conversation is sitting with everyone now, from the panel to the audience. One of the co-hosts exhales slowly and leans forward, her tone softer, more reflective. I think what's really striking about this moment is that neither of you is wrong, but you're coming at it from completely different lived perspectives. Alyssa Farah Griffin nods, her posture easing just slightly for the first time in a while. I can agree with that, she says. And I don't think disagreement is a bad thing. I think it's necessary. Keira Knightley nods as well, her expression calmer now, though still serious. It is. And I think conversations like this are important, even when they're uncomfortable. The audience responds with a softer, more thoughtful round of applause. For a moment, it feels like the tension might finally settle into something more reflective, more resolved. But one of the hosts glances at the clock and then back to the table. We're almost out of time, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface. A few audience members laugh, some nodding in agreement. Alyssa smiles faintly. Yeah, I don't think this is a 5-minute conversation. Keira lets out a small laugh. Definitely not. Another host jumps in, trying to wrap things while still honoring the intensity. Before we go, I just want to give both of you a chance to say one final thought, just to kind of leave the audience with where you stand. There's a brief pause as Alyssa gestures for Keira to go first. Keira takes a second, then speaks, slower now, more measured than at any point earlier. I think, she begins, that it's important to allow people to speak about their experiences without immediately questioning their right to do so. That doesn't mean you can't challenge what's being said, but the starting point shouldn't be doubt. The audience listens quietly, then responds with steady applause. Alyssa nods, taking that in before offering her own closing thought. I agree that people should be able to share their experiences, she says. But I also think that when you have a large platform, it's important to constantly reflect on how your voice fits into a bigger conversation, and whether it's helping to elevate others or unintentionally speaking over them. Another wave of applause follows, balanced this time, reflecting the split perspectives in the room. One of the co-hosts smiles, looking between them. And I think that right there is the conversation. It's not about choosing one side, it's about understanding both. The audience claps again, this time louder, appreciative of the attempt to bring things together. The segment wraps with a polite exchange, smiles, a brief handshake across the table, a few light comments to ease the mood. But even as the cameras pull back and the applause continues, you can tell the conversation hasn't really ended. As the show cuts to commercial, the energy in the studio doesn't immediately reset. Audience members are still talking among themselves, some clearly siding with Keira, others with Alyssa, many just processing what they've heard. Off camera, the hosts lean in closer, their voices lower now but still engaged. One of them gestures animatedly, clearly continuing the discussion even without the microphones fully capturing it. Keira takes a sip of water, exhaling quietly, while Alyssa flips through her notes again. Not because she needs them, but because the habit gives her a moment to reset. There's no hostility, but there's no pretending that nothing happened either. By the time the show returns from commercial, the tone is lighter, the next segment intentionally more relaxed. But the earlier conversation lingers in the background, something the audience hasn't forgotten. And neither has social media. Within minutes of the segment airing, clips begin circulating online. Short moments, Keira saying, "Pressure isn't a competition." Alyssa asking, "But do you think it's enough?" The exchange about performative comments. The line about moving the goalpost. Viewers are reacting fast. Some posts praise Keira for standing her ground, calling her responses composed, thoughtful, and unapologetically honest. Others side with Alyssa, saying she asked necessary questions and brought up important accountability. Debates start forming in comment sections almost instantly. People begin breaking down specific moments, who interrupted who made the stronger point, whether the conversation stayed respectful or crossed into tension. Clips rack up views quickly, with captions framing the moment in completely different ways depending on the perspective. Some highlight it as a powerful discussion. Others label it a heated clash. By the end of the day, it's one of the most talked about segments from the show that week. Backstage, after the cameras are fully off, there's a quieter version of the same conversation happening. Alyssa approaches Keira, her tone calm, professional. "Hey, I hope you know none of that was meant to be personal." Keira nods, equally composed. "I didn't take it that way." There's a brief pause, not awkward, just honest. "I think it was a good conversation," Alyssa adds. Keira agrees. "I do too, even if it got intense." They both share a small laugh, not dismissing what happened, but acknowledging it. One of the producers walks by, smiling. That's the kind of TV people remember. Another host joins them briefly, adding, "You both handled it really well." And that's the thing. Despite the tension, despite the disagreement, there's a level of respect that remains intact. No one storms off. No one refuses to engage. It was a real conversation with real disagreement, played out in front of a live audience. And that's exactly why it resonated. Because it didn't feel scripted. It didn't feel staged. It felt like two perspectives meeting head-on, without easy answers, without a neat resolution. Just a conversation that kept going, even after the cameras stopped. And now it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think? Was Keira right to push back the way she did? Or did Alyssa raise the more important points about accountability and platform? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.